The car was engulfed in flames. Smoke billowed into the night sky, and the distant wail of sirens was drowned out by the crackling fire. Inside the burning vehicle, a boy was screaming, his small hands frantically pounding against the window. Around him, people stood frozen in shock, some pulling out their phones, others shouting for help, but no one moved close. Among the onlookers, a man staggered forward, his clothes wrinkled and stained, the stale scent of alcohol clinging to him. His eyes, bloodshot and weary, were fixed on the car. For a moment he stood there, swaying slightly, as if deciding whether this was real or just another hallucination. Then, without a word, he broke into a run. He stumbled toward the car, ignoring the shouts behind him. The heat was intense, the flames licking the side of his face as he reached the door. He could see the boy's terrified eyes through the glass, wide and pleading. The man's heart pounded, not from fear, but from a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. "Move back!" someone yelled, but the man didn't listen. He grabbed a rock from the ground, raising it high before smashing it into the window. The glass shattered, and a burst of heat and smoke hit him in the face, searing his skin. He coughed, his eyes watering, but he reached inside, grasping for the boy. The boy screamed as the man's hands closed around his arm. "It's okay, kid," the man muttered, though he wasn't sure if the boy could hear him over the roaring flames. He pulled with all his strength, feeling the boy's weight shift towards him. The metal of the car door was scorching against his forearm, but he didn't let go. Not now. With a final tug, the boy was out. The man stumbled back, falling to the ground with the boy clutched to his chest. For a split second, the world was silent. Then the crowd erupted in noise, a cacophony of shouts and gasps. The man gasped for air, his lungs burning, his skin searing with pain. The boy was crying, clinging to him, his small body shaking. The man looked down at him. His arm throbbed, and when he glanced at it, he saw the angry red burn, the skin already blistering. He winced but pushed himself to his feet. "You're safe now?" he rasped, setting the boy down. The boy looked up at him, tears streaming down his soot-covered face. Before anyone could approach, the man turned away. He faded into the crowd, his steps unsteady but determined. Behind him, the sound of sirens grew louder as fire trucks and ambulances arrived. He didn't look back. He didn't wait for thanks or recognition. In his mind, he was already gone. In the chaos that followed, no one noticed the man slip away. By the time the paramedics reached the boy, the man had disappeared into the night, leaving only the scent of smoke and the distant echo of his words. He wandered down the empty streets, his mind racing. The adrenaline that had pushed him through the flames was fading, replaced by a throbbing pain in his arm and a heavy, familiar emptiness in his chest. He didn't know why he had done it, why he had risked his life for a child he didn't know. Maybe it was instinct, a reflex from a time when he still believed he could make a difference. Or maybe it was just a moment of madness, a final grasp at meaning in a life that had long since lost it. He reached the edge of the city, where the streetlights dimmed and shadows stretched long. There he slumped against a wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked down at his arm again, the burn throbbing angrily. It would leave a scar, but he couldn't bring himself to care. Scars were just another part of him now. As he sat there, he could still hear the boy's screams, see the terror in his eyes. And for the first time in years, something inside him stirred. He felt a pang of, was it hope? No, it couldn't be. It was just the aftershock, the adrenaline playing tricks on him. Whatever it was, it wouldn't last. It never did. He closed his eyes, letting the cool night air wash over him. He was just a man with nothing left to lose, a ghost who had wandered into the flames and come out the other side. Tomorrow he'd be back to what he was, forgotten, invisible. But tonight, just for a moment, he had been something else. He had been a hero. The man's nights after the rescue blurred into each other, just as they had before. He drifted through the days, finding solace at the bottom of a bottle. Yet something had shifted. The boy's terrified eyes haunted him, appearing in the dark corners of his mind. In the quiet hours of the night, when the city was still and his thoughts were loud, he would see those eyes again and again. They reminded him of a different time, a different life. Years ago, he had been someone else, someone with a purpose, with a family and a future. He had a job he cared about, a firefighter. It was more than a job, it was a calling. He had loved the thrill of saving lives, the camaraderie with his fellow firefighters, and the satisfaction of making a difference. But life had a way of unraveling even the strongest threads. It started with the fire that he couldn't control, the one where everything went wrong. They arrived at a house engulfed in flames, and inside were people he was supposed to save. They had drilled for scenarios like this countless times. He knew the protocols, the procedures. But that night, the fire seemed to have a mind of its own, swallowing everything in its path. He rushed in with his team, but the heat was unbearable, the smoke too thick. In the chaos, he lost his way. When they finally pulled him out, he was alive, but others were not. The faces of the people he couldn't save were burned into his memory. And it wasn't just the strangers he couldn't reach. It was his team too. He had seen one of his fellow firefighters go down in the blaze, heard his screams cut through the roar of the flames. They had been like brothers, and he felt their loss like a knife to the heart. After that, everything fell apart. He couldn't sleep without seeing the flames, hearing the screams. He started drinking to drown the memories, to dull the pain. His hands shook when he tried to hold his gear, and his mind replayed that night over and over. It wasn't long before he was asked to step down, for his safety and the safety of others. They had been gentle about it, but he knew what they meant. He was a liability, a broken man who couldn't be trusted in the heat of the moment. Losing the job was the final blow. Without the station, without the brotherhood he had known, he was adrift. His wife, already strained from his distance and grief, couldn't hold on any longer. She left, taking their young daughter with her. He didn't blame her. He barely recognized himself. What was left was a shell of the man he used to be, hollowed out by guilt and regret. The years that followed were a blur of alcohol and half-forgotten days. He moved from job to job, losing them as quickly as he found them. No one wanted a washed-up firefighter who reeked of booze and carried the dead in his eyes. Eventually, he stopped trying to find work. He let himself fall through the cracks, becoming one of the invisible people who haunted the edges of society. He wandered the streets, a ghost of a man who once ran into burning buildings. But that night, the night he saved the boy, something in him had flickered to life. It was an echo of the man he used to be, the man who didn't hesitate in the face of danger. He hadn't thought. He had just acted. And for those brief, burning moments, he had been back in the fire, not as a victim, but as a savior. Yet as the days passed, that feeling faded. It was replaced by the old emptiness, the familiar numbness he had come to know. He told himself it didn't matter. The boy was safe, and that was enough. He went back to his routine, back to the bottle, trying to forget the fire in the boy's eyes, just as he had tried to forget all the others. But deep down, he knew something had changed. The act of saving that boy had stirred something in him that he couldn't quite bury. It gnawed at him, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely lost, that there was still a part of him capable of doing good. But could one act erase years of failure? Could it bring back the man he used to be? Or was it just a cruel trick of fate, offering him a glimpse of redemption only to snatch it away? He didn't have the answers. All he had was the bottle, the streets, and the ghosts that walked beside him. So he continued, drifting through the city like a wraith, the boy's screams and his own unanswered questions echoing in his mind. And each night, as he lay down to the cold comfort of the pavement, he wondered if he would ever find peace, or if he was destined to remain a shadow of the man he once was. The boy remembered the fire, but more than that, he remembered the man who pulled him out of it. In the years that followed, the memory of that night stayed with him, vivid, haunting, but also strangely empowering. He didn't remember the man's face clearly. It had been obscured by smoke and shadows. But he remembered the strength of the man's grip, the urgency in his actions. And most of all, he remembered the man's eyes, filled with a mix of fear, determination, and something else that he would only understand as he grew older: pain. He had been only 7 when it happened. For months after, he would wake up screaming, the smell of smoke still lingering in his nostrils. His parents had tried to comfort him, telling him that it was all over, that he was safe now. But safety was a fragile thing. He knew it could be shattered in an instant, and that knowledge stayed with him. The physical wounds healed quickly, leaving behind a scar on his arm, a mark where the flames had seared his skin. The scar was an ugly, twisted thing at first, a painful reminder of what he had been through. But over time, it became something else, a badge of survival. When he was old enough to understand more about what happened, his parents told him about the man who had saved him. A stranger, they said. No one knew who he was. He had just appeared out of nowhere, pulled him from the car, and vanished. The boy would ask about him constantly. What did he look like? Where did he go? But no one had answers. To them, the man was a mystery, a ghost who had saved a life and then disappeared. For the boy, the man became a figure of legend, someone he built up in his mind. He wasn't just the man who saved him. He was a hero, someone who had risked everything for a child he didn't know. That thought stayed with him, growing with him. As he got older, he began to understand the weight of that act. The scar on his arm was a constant reminder of it, of the man who had given him a second chance at life. It was in middle school that he discovered basketball. He had tried other sports, soccer, baseball, but nothing clicked. Basketball, though, was different. There was something about the rhythm of the game, the way it demanded focus and agility, that drew him in. On the court, he could forget about the fire, the nightmares, the fear. He could lose himself in the game, in the movement. And for the first time since the accident, he felt like he had control over something. His parents encouraged him, happy to see him find an outlet. They watched as he threw himself into the sport with a passion they hadn't seen in him before. He practiced for hours, even when it was just him and a hoop in their driveway. His arm still bore the scar, a thick, twisted line of tissue that snaked from his wrist to his elbow. Some kids asked about it, and at first he was embarrassed, unsure how to explain. But as he got older, his embarrassment turned to pride. It was a part of him, a part of his story. By high school, he was one of the best players on his team. Coaches noticed his determination, the way he played as if every game was his last. He wasn't the tallest or the fastest, but he had an edge that set him apart. When they asked him what drove him, he didn't have a simple answer. How could he explain that every time he stepped onto the court, he was playing for the man who saved him? For the life he almost lost? He didn't know who that man was or where he had gone. Sometimes, late at night, he would wonder if the man was still out there somewhere. Did he think about the boy he saved? Did he know what it meant to him? He wanted to believe that he did, that somewhere the man was watching, knowing that his act of courage had sparked something in the boy. Basketball gave him a focus, a drive. It was more than just a game. It was a way to honor the life he had been given. On the court, he was fearless, willing to take risks, to push himself to his limits. Every time he fell, every time he missed a shot, he got back up and tried again, because he knew what it meant to come back from the brink, to survive. The scar on his arm faded with time, but it never disappeared, and he didn't want it to. He would trace it with his finger sometimes, feeling the raised skin, remembering the heat of the flames and the strength of the hands that had pulled him free. In those moments, he felt a connection to the man, even if he didn't know who he was. It was as if that scar was a tether, a line that tied them together across time and space. As he entered his final year of high school, basketball became more than just an escape. It became a path forward. College scouts were beginning to take notice. His coach talked about scholarships, about a future in the sport. It was everything he had worked for, but in his heart, it was more than that. It was proof that he was alive, that he had made it through the fire. And it was all because of the man who had saved him. He knew the odds of ever finding that man were slim. Maybe he was gone, just a fleeting presence in his life meant to be remembered but never seen again. But he held on to the hope, however faint, that one day he might have the chance to say thank you, to show the man who saved him what he had become. Until then, he would keep playing, for himself, for his family, and for the man who had given him the chance to do so. Every shot he took, every game he played was a tribute, a way to say, I'm still here. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years, and the man continued his spiral into obscurity. His life had settled into a routine of sorts, a routine of surviving each day, not really living it. The bottle was his constant companion, dulling the edges of a world that seemed to have no place for him anymore. He moved from shelter to shelter, always on the move. In some towns, people knew him as the quiet drifter who kept to himself. In others, he was just another face among the countless souls wandering the streets. His appearance became more disheveled, his eyes hollow. Yet despite his efforts to drown his past, memories of the boy would surface at the most unexpected moments. Sometimes in the early hours of dawn, when the streets were empty and silent, he would see the boy's face in his mind, those wide, terrified eyes staring back at him through the flames. It wasn't a haunting vision like those from his firefighting days, but it stayed with him. It was a memory that refused to fade. He found himself touching the burn scar on his arm, the one he had received that night. The skin had healed over time, but the mark was still there, a twisted, rough patch that stood out against the rest of his skin. He would trace it absently with his fingers, feeling its texture. It was a reminder, a symbol of what he had done and what he had once been. But instead of pride, it filled him with a bitter ache. The boy had lived. That was something he knew. In the days after the rescue, he had heard whispers about how the child was recovering. But for the man, it hadn't been enough to change the course of his own life. Each time he thought about the boy, he asked himself the same question. Did it matter? Did saving one life erase all his failures? Could it change the fact that he had let so many others slip through his grasp, that he had fallen so far? The weight of those questions was suffocating, and the bottle was the only thing that seemed to silence them, at least temporarily. Occasionally, he would do small acts of kindness for others on the street. A meal shared, a blanket offered to someone shivering in the cold. They were fleeting gestures, unnoticed by most, and he did them almost out of habit. He never stayed in one place long enough to form connections. He didn't want to be seen or remembered. He was a ghost drifting through the city, his past trailing behind him like a shadow. Yet there were moments, brief as they were, when he wondered if he could have more, if there was still something in him worth saving. He would push those thoughts away, telling himself it was too late. Whatever goodness had been in him had burned out long ago, in the fires he couldn't control, in the lives he couldn't save. But the boy had survived. That fact gnawed at him. It was like a small light in the darkness of his mind, flickering but refusing to go out. No matter how much he drank, no matter how far he wandered, that light stayed with him. It was a reminder of who he had been for just a moment. A man who had acted without hesitation, who had saved a life when it mattered most. He would never be a hero again. He knew that. But sometimes, in the silence of his own mind, he allowed himself to think that perhaps he wasn't a complete failure. That maybe in that one act, he had found a fragment of redemption, even if it was fleeting. Still, the life he led was not one of hope. It was survival, nothing more. He was a man adrift, existing on the edges of society. He didn't seek out the boy, didn't try to find out what had become of him. It was better that way. The boy had his life, his chance to grow and be something better. The man was just the shadow that had slipped into the flames and pulled him out. His story was over, or so he believed. As he lay down one night in the corner of an alley, the cold seeping into his bones, he stared up at the stars. His arm throbbed where the scar was, a dull ache that had become part of him. He closed his eyes and for a moment saw the boy's face again, those eyes that looked up at him in fear and then relief. He sighed, the breath misting in the cold air. Maybe it did matter, he thought. Maybe saving one life was enough. But as he drifted off into a fitful sleep, the doubts crept back in, wrapping around him like the darkness. And so he continued to drift, caught between the memory of that one bright moment and the shadows of everything that came before. 10 years had passed since that night. The boy was no longer a frightened child, but a young man with purpose. Basketball had become more than just a game for him. It was a lifeline, a way to channel his energy and remember why he was alive. He had grown into a talented player, known for his unwavering determination on the court. Coaches often remarked on his focus, his drive. When asked what pushed him, he would glance at the scar on his arm and simply say, "It's a reminder." Today was the day he had worked toward for years. It was the state championship game, the final match of his high school career. The gymnasium was packed with students, parents, and fans, all buzzing with excitement. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that makes every heartbeat feel like the ticking of a clock. For the boy, now a young man, this was more than just a game. It was his moment to prove that he had survived for a reason. On the other side of town, the man woke up in a shelter. The days blurred together in the routine of survival. He had learned not to think too far ahead, to focus only on the next meal, the next place to sleep. But today, something was different. One of the shelter volunteers, an old man with a kind face, approached him with an invitation. "They've got an extra ticket to the big game today," the volunteer said, his voice warm but insistent. "Why don't you come along? Get out for a bit." The man started to refuse, out of habit more than anything. But the volunteer pressed the ticket into his hand. "You need this," he said simply, his eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. So for reasons he couldn't fully explain, the man found himself on a bus, clutching the ticket, staring out the window as the city passed by. When they arrived at the gymnasium, he hung back, feeling out of place. He didn't belong in the bright lights and cheering crowds, but the volunteer gave him a reassuring nod, guiding him toward the entrance. Inside, the noise was deafening. The man shuffled toward the back, finding a seat in the shadows where he could watch without being seen. On the court, the teams were warming up, the players moving with an energy that made him feel every one of his years. He recognized the drive in their eyes, the hunger for something more than just victory. Then the game began. The young man, now a star player, took his place on the court. The man in the shadows watched as the boy moved with grace and determination, the ball seeming to flow effortlessly through his hands. He was good, better than the man had imagined. There was a fierceness in his play, a fire that burned in his eyes. And there, on his arm, the man saw it, the scar. His breath caught in his throat. For a moment, the world around him faded, and he was back in that night, back in the flames. The boy, no, the young man, was the child he had saved. There was no mistaking it. The scar was a mark that had tied them together all this time. His hands shook and he gripped the edge of his seat, his mind racing. The game was close, a constant back and forth that had the crowd on the edge of their seats. With seconds left on the clock, the score was tied. The young man's team called a timeout. The coach's voice was a distant murmur to the man in the shadows, who could only watch as the young man nodded, his eyes fixed with determination. The buzzer sounded and the ball was inbounded. The young man moved swiftly, darting past defenders. The seconds ticked down. 5, 4, 3. He was at the three-point line. The gymnasium was a blur of noise and motion. But for the man in the shadows, time seemed to slow. The young man leaped, the ball leaving his hands in a perfect arc. The crowd held its breath as the ball soared through the air. The man could see it all with crystal clarity. The arc, the focus in the young man's eyes, the scar on his arm catching the light. And then the ball swished through the net. The gym erupted. The young man's team swarmed the court, lifting him into the air as the crowd roared. But for the man, the world had gone silent. He watched the young man with a mix of awe and disbelief. The boy he had saved was not just alive. He was thriving. He was a symbol of everything the man had once believed in, but had lost sight of. Tears filled his eyes. He wanted to leave, to escape the overwhelming flood of emotions, but he couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the young man who now stood before the crowd. His arm raised high, the scar clearly visible. It was in that moment that the young man looked up into the stands. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for something or someone. And for a brief, fleeting second, their eyes met. The man in the shadows knew the young man couldn't recognize him, not with the years and the distance between them. But the young man hesitated, his gaze lingering as if sensing a connection, an unspoken truth. The man swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been a ghost for so long, a man lost to his own failures. Yet here, in this gymnasium, he saw what he had done, the life he had saved, and what that life had become. The young man had found purpose, had found a way to honor the life he had been given. The man wiped his eyes, the cheers of the crowd washing over him. For the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt proud, not of himself, but of the young man. He had given him a chance, and the boy had taken it, turning it into something beautiful. He stayed there in the shadows, watching as the team celebrated. The young man was surrounded by friends and family, his face glowing with the joy of the moment. And the man knew that whether or not the young man ever found out who had saved him, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was here, that he had lived to see this day. For the man, that was enough. The gymnasium slowly began to empty as the celebrations continued. The young man had been hoisted on the shoulders of his teammates, carried around in a victory lap that felt almost surreal. But even in the midst of the cheering, the laughter, and the roaring excitement, a part of him felt drawn to something else. Someone else. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, someone who meant more than just a supportive fan in the stands. His eyes kept darting to the shadows, to the far corner of the gym where a solitary figure had been sitting. There was something about the way the man had looked at him, the intensity in his gaze. It was almost like recognition. The young man excused himself, slipping away from the crowd of well-wishers. He made his way toward the far side of the gym, where the lights were dimmer, the air quieter. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of adrenaline from the game and something else, anticipation, maybe even fear. He reached the corner, but the seat was empty. The man was gone. He looked around, scanning the exits, the hallways, catching only a fleeting glimpse of a figure disappearing into a side corridor. Without thinking, he followed, his footsteps echoing softly against the polished floor. The corridor was nearly deserted, lit only by a few flickering overhead lights. The young man slowed his pace, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Ahead of him, he saw the man standing with his back turned, shoulders slumped, as if carrying the weight of the world. The young man hesitated, suddenly unsure of what to say or even why he had followed. But he couldn't turn back now. He had to know. "Hey!" he called out, his voice unsteady in the stillness of the corridor. The man stiffened at the sound, but he didn't turn around. For a moment, there was only silence between them, a silence filled with the ghosts of 10 long years. "Why did you leave?" the young man asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Why didn't you stay?" Slowly the man turned. His face was lined with age and hardship, his eyes shadowed by years of pain and regret. But the young man saw something familiar in those eyes, a glimmer of the same look he had seen that night, the look of someone who had acted in the face of fear. The man opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked down at his hands, the burn scar still visible on his arm. He had hidden from this moment for so long, convinced that he didn't deserve it, that he was unworthy of any acknowledgement. But now, standing here, face to face with the boy he had saved, he realized that the truth was unavoidable. I didn't think it mattered," the man finally said, his voice rough and raw. "I thought you were better off not knowing." The young man took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the scar. "You saved my life," he said, his voice trembling. "You gave me a chance to be here, to live this moment. How could that not matter?" The man's eyes were wet now, the emotions he had buried for so long rushing to the surface. "I was nobody," he whispered, "just a broken man who happened to be there. I didn't think it would change anything." "But it did," the young man insisted. He raised his own arm, showing the scar that ran down from his wrist to his elbow. "This scar, it's a reminder that I was given a second chance. Because of you." The man stared at the scar, feeling his breath hitch in his chest. He reached out, hesitating, his fingers hovering over the young man's arm. Then, slowly, he touched the scar, feeling its rough texture beneath his fingertips. It was real. He was real. And so was the boy he had saved. Tears slipped down the man's cheeks, the dam finally breaking. I thought I was beyond saving," he confessed, his voice cracking. "I thought that saving you was just a fluke, that it wouldn't mean anything." The young man shook his head, his eyes shining with conviction. "You were a hero that day, and not just to me." He paused, searching for the right words. "You showed me that courage exists, even when everything seems lost. You gave me hope, and that hope carried me through every struggle, every doubt." The man felt a surge of emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He had been living in darkness for so long, convinced that his life was a series of failures and regrets. But here, standing before him, was proof that his life had made a difference, that in that one moment of bravery, he had done something good. "I've spent so many years running," the man said, his voice hoarse, "running from what I was, what I had become. I didn't think I could ever face it." "You don't have to run anymore," the young man replied softly. "You saved me, and that mattered. It mattered more than you'll ever know. For a long moment they stood there in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air between them. The man let out a shuddering breath, feeling a warmth spread through him that he hadn't felt in a decade. It was like the first rays of dawn breaking through a long, dark night. "Thank you," the man said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Thank you for finding me." The young man smiled, a mixture of sadness and relief in his eyes. "No," he said. "Thank you for saving me." They stood there, two souls connected by a single life-changing act. For the young man, this was a moment of closure, of understanding that the scar on his arm was more than a reminder of pain. It was a testament to bravery and sacrifice. For the man, it was a revelation that his life, no matter how broken, had held meaning, had created light in the midst of darkness. The young man reached out, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It said, "You're not alone." It said, "You mattered." The man nodded, feeling a tear slip down his cheek. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like there was a future. He felt like he could face it. Together they turned back toward the light at the end of the corridor, toward the gymnasium where the celebrations continued. The man knew he wasn't walking into the light as a hero. He was walking in as a man who had been lost and was finally finding his way back. And for the first time in years, that was enough. The weeks that followed the championship game felt like a new chapter for both of them. The young man returned to his routine, but something fundamental had changed. He no longer saw his scar merely as a reminder of a painful past. It had become a symbol of connection, a bridge between his life and the man who had saved him. He carried it with pride, not just as a survivor, but as someone who had been touched by an act of courage that shaped who he had become. The man, on the other hand, was learning to navigate a world that he had long shut himself out from. After their conversation in the corridor, he had taken a tentative step forward, accepting the help offered by the shelter and the volunteers who had tried to reach him for so long. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of his past threatened to pull him back into the darkness. But now he had something to hold on to, a reason to believe that he could be more than his failures. He started with small steps. He began attending support meetings at the shelter, sharing his story with others who had walked similar paths of despair. At first the words were heavy, coming out in fits and starts. But as he spoke, he found that there was a kind of release in the telling. The others listened without judgment, their own scars and stories mingling with his. For the first time in years, he felt understood, felt seen. The young man visited him regularly. They didn't talk about that night again, not in detail. They didn't need to. Their conversations were about the present, about basketball, about life. Sometimes they just sat in silence, watching the world go by, a quiet understanding passing between them. The man still had a long way to go. He knew that. There were still nights when he woke up in a cold sweat, the old fears and memories clawing at him. But he faced those nights differently now. He knew that he wasn't defined solely by his past, nor by his darkest moments. He was also defined by that single act of courage, by the life he had helped save, and by the person that life had become. One day, as they were sitting on a bench overlooking the park near the shelter, the young man looked at him and said, "You know, they're looking for a new assistant coach at the community center. Someone who can help guide the kids, teach them about more than just the game." The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You think anyone wants to learn from an old washed-up guy like me?" The young man grinned. "I do, and I think those kids will too. You have more to teach than you realize." The man was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the children playing basketball across the park. Could he really be that person? Could he be someone who gave hope rather than just clung to the remnants of it? He didn't know, but as he glanced at the young man beside him, he felt a warmth spread through his chest. "I'll think about it," he said finally. And for the first time, he meant it. They continued to sit there as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the court. The man knew that he wasn't cured, that there were still wounds that would never fully heal. But he also knew that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about finding a way to live with it and move forward. As they sat in comfortable silence, the young man glanced at his scar, then at the man's. They were different, but they were also the same, marks of a shared history, of pain, courage, and the journey to something better. He had learned that scars weren't just reminders of what had been lost, but also of what had been saved. The man took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. For the first time in a long time, he looked at the world around him and saw not just the shadows, but the light. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about being here, about being present, about the chance to make a difference, even in the smallest of ways. "Thank you," he said quietly. Not just to the young man, but to the world, to himself, to the chance that had brought them both to this point. The young man smiled. "No, thank you." And so they sat together, two lives forever intertwined, each finding their own path forward. It wasn't a path free of struggles, but it was one filled with a newfound sense of purpose. The man wasn't just a shadow anymore. He was a part of something, someone who had made a difference. And for the young man, he was the living proof of the power of hope. The reality that sometimes heroes are just ordinary people who step up when it matters most. They stayed there until the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted with the colors of a new beginning. For both of them, the future was no longer a thing to fear, but a horizon to be reached. Months passed, and life settled into a new rhythm for both of them. The man took up the young man's suggestion and began volunteering at the community center as an assistant coach. It was slow at first. He was hesitant, unsure of himself, but the kids quickly warmed up to him, drawn to the quiet strength and wisdom that he carried. They listened when he spoke, not because of his past, but because of who he was in the present. He watched as the kids on the court faced their own struggles, the missed shots, the frustrations, the small victories. In their eyes, he saw the echoes of his own journey, the fight to find something to hold on to when everything seemed uncertain. He shared his lessons with them, not just about basketball, but about life, resilience, and the importance of getting back up after every fall. For the young man, things were also changing. He received offers from colleges and chose one where he could continue playing basketball while also pursuing his studies. His life was moving forward, filled with opportunities that had once seemed like distant dreams. Yet, through it all, he maintained his bond with the man who had once been his savior. They met regularly, sometimes on the basketball court, other times in the park. Each encounter a reminder of the journey they had shared. One evening, as they sat in the bleachers of the community center, watching the kids play, the man turned to the young man. "You know," he began, his voice thoughtful, "I used to think that being a hero was about doing something extraordinary. But now I think it's more about the small things, the choices we make every day, the people we help without even realizing it." The young man nodded, looking out at the court. "You've been that hero," he said. "Not just for me, but for these kids too. You've shown them what it means to keep going, even when things are tough." The man smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. He no longer saw himself as a ghost of his past. He was here, in the present, making a difference in the lives around him. His scars, both physical and emotional, were not marks of failure, but testaments to survival and the power of human connection. As they sat there, the man realized that this moment, this simple act of being present, was the true victory. It wasn't about erasing the past or becoming a hero in the eyes of others. It was about finding peace within himself, about learning that he could be a part of something meaningful again. The young man looked over at him, a knowing smile on his face. "We're all just trying to make our way, aren't we?" The man nodded, his eyes misty but clear. "Yeah," he said, "and sometimes we need a little help along the way." Together they watched the game, the sound of laughter and the thud of basketballs echoing around them. The gym was filled with the promise of new beginnings, with the understanding that life was not about the moments of heroism alone, but about the courage to live each day with purpose, despite the scars. And in that understanding, they found a quiet kind of grace, a peace that had eluded them for so long. The future was still uncertain, but they were no longer afraid of it. They had faced the fire, walked through it, and come out the other side. They were still here, and for them, that was enough.